Ahoy! The most recent patch changed a ton about the damage output of different weapons, especially the Greatsword was nerfed, and that affects a lot of things in PvE. Today we're looking into those changes and we're looking at the effects this has on DPS, damage per second, for all of these different weapons. There are some very interesting results here in terms of how far weapons are apart, which weapons are performing best and worst. There are some very unexpected ones that snuck their way up and down. So this may excite some of you and also frustrate some of you if you've been running one of the weapons that kind of dropped off a bit this patch. Now, New World doesn't actually have DPS meters, so we can't just measure it that way, but there is a way to do it now, and XR went through the testing for all of the weapons. Since target dummies got changed and now have roughly 485,000 health, what you can do is use an optimal damage rotation of abilities and attacks until the target dummy is at 0 health, and then check how many seconds it took, and then from there you can go backwards and figure out what this time span means in terms of damage per second done, how long it took to get rid of 485,000 health. Since target dummies don't have a mob type, you can then very easily apply the multipliers for different mob types to figure out how much a weapon would actually do against a particular mob type. Before we get into anything else, you first need to know what was actually used to test DPS. So XR used 2 perk weapons that have very high damaging perks for optimal DPS. However, the third perk was left open because that for any expedition, for any PvE content, would be replaced with Bane for the mob type of that expedition. Along with that, he also ran a ring that increases the matching damage type of the weapon, so for example a thrust ring for the Rapier, and various armor perks that are all listed here. For most weapons, that is simply Vicious and Keenly Empowered, because Vicious is generally a very strong perk in PvE, and Keenly Empowered is very good for most weapons except those that have a bunch of self-empowers and make you reach cap. On melee weapons, Rogue can outclass Vicious, but on some melee weapons like the Rapier it doesn't work properly, so on the Spear and on the Hatchet for example, you will see Rogue here as well as on the Warhammer, while on the Greatsword, even after this patch, your go-to is Transcend Strikes. Another notable outlier is the Sword and Shield, where we have Enchanted, Rogue and Keenly Empowered. Now there are certain situations where you can technically run more than that, like Keenly Jagged as well, but keep in mind that many Bane shields that exist in the game are locked in terms of what they offer, and also not every mob type even has a Bane shield. For example, there are no human Bane shields. You can't craft those, they just drop for certain Bane types in expeditions. Since this DPS testing assumes double Bane for Sword and Shield, it's already kind of favorable in that regard, so 3 damaging perks is very reasonable here. You can find all the builds that were used down in the description. So the first mob type we're looking at is Angry Earth, and let's actually start at the bottom, at the D tier, and work our way up. Very down there is the Warhammer, both with heavy attacks and light attacks, both around 8,000 DPS, and the Void Gauntlet is in the same place. The Void Gauntlet once upon a time used to be one of the best DPS weapons, if not the best, but was massively nerfed because it was so strong in that regard. So those are kind of just down there, not really surprising with Angry Earth either. The next one is a bit more of a surprise, which is the Fire Staff with Flamethrower at 8,500 DPS. Now keep in mind that the Fire Staff can be used with an Ice Gauntlet in the offhand. We'll talk about that aspect later. For now we'll look at the weapons without the secondary weapons, but we'll get to that part. The Bow without Rapid Shot has around the same damage, and the Spear with rolls between the attacks has 8,900 damage. The Great Axe, also not exactly a DPS weapon, but a nice control weapon, comes at 9,100 DPS. In the B tier, we have the Greatsword with 9,100 DPS as well, but this is the Defiant stance version, which has reduced damage. The Blunderbuss has 9,100 damage too. Keep in mind that the Blunderbuss is really not a great DPS weapon. It is a fantastic burst weapon and you can kind of chain it as an offhand weapon, but if you're purely trying to DPS with the Blunderbuss, it will typically be outclassed. The Bow with Rapid Shot here comes in at 9,150. For a weapon that's performing insanely well in PvP, the PvE performance of the Bow is still not particularly impressive, at least, even with the Bane buff. But the next one is going to be one that will maybe shock a few people. The Hatchet, after its nerfs, is dropped down to 9,350 DPS with a Defy Death build, and this is against Angry Earth, so this is where Hatchet has a type advantage. But worry not, there is an alternative. Speaking of type advantage, by the way, the Fire Staff with a Meteor Shower build comes in at 9,800 DPS, which is at least more than you get with the Flamethrower, but still Not exactly top tier for a Angry Earth situation, but we have another option there too. The last one in B tier is the bow assuming 100% headshot, which is 10,400 DPS. Realistically, you won't be able to do that in most situations, but there are some bosses where it's possible. Likewise, we have the blunderbuss with 100% headshot rate at almost the same damage, 10,550, but again, this is something that is very rare to actually be usable. What is usable is the Ice Gauntlet in a spike build. This is 10,750 DPS, more than many of the Fire Staffs builds actually, which is kind of impressive. If you find this information useful so far, please consider subscribing. But I told you there's an option to make the Hatchet at least a little bit more effective in an Angry Earth situation, which is kind of where it belongs along with other situations where Slash has an advantage. And that is with the Right Tree ultimate. In this case, you're getting up to 10,750 DPS. It's almost like getting a 12% damage increase is actually useful. Now what I will say at this point is that you have to keep in mind that a lot of people specifically prefer the Hatchet for PvE because it has that crutch option with Defy Death. And if you're still going that path, you will notice your damage drop off in comparison. There are many other weapons that will out DPS a full left tree hatchet at this point, or even a mostly left tree hatchet. And we have noticed this on our expedition runs as well. We are pugging quite a lot at the moment, taking a few extra DPS in with us, and when they were running hatchet, they were typically doing quite a fair bit less damage than most other DPS focused options that you can run these days. But don't let that worry you too much, because there is another weapon that kind of fills the niche of the hatchet very well now that you can switch over to very easily. But we're not quite there yet. The burstiest Fire Staff build is yet to come, right above the hatchet here, 10,870 for the Incinerate build. Now while this isn't the highest single target DPS, keep in mind that the Fire Staff damage translates very well into AoE damage too. And to close out A tier, we have the Rapier Evade build. The Rapier was previously very difficult to test because it's not really something you can test through normal attacks, but now we have the means to actually test Rapier damage. And with the Rapier mainly having benefited from changes while other weapons got pretty significant nerfs, it's popping off. The Rapier in an Evade build does 11,100 damage on Angry Earth. But another slash damage contender is finally leaving its direct competition, the Hatchet, in the dust, and that is the Sword and Shield. If you have Double Bane, you pull out 11,886 damage here. Now keep in mind, again, not every weapon can have Double Bane, not every build can have Double Bane because certain mob types don't have Bane shields, so it's not always going to be quite the same, but generally the Sword is definitely a decent performer where it has type advantage. But I'm not going to tell any Hatchet user to switch to Sword and Shield when there is a much more convenient option right above that. In the S tier we have the Spear with light attacks. This does 12,211 DPS, you're just chaining light attacks and cancelling into abilities in between, and it's just absolutely insane DPS for a weapon that was previously primarily used for utility. Keep in mind that the numbers here are slightly skewed in favor of Spear because we are running this with attunement, whereas in most situations people will typically have Enfeebling Skewer on their Spear in PvE. It's just such a nice safety option that you are probably not going to skip it. But that's a fairly minimal DPS drop, and then you have two weakens going on at the same time. You have the Perforate weaken and you have the Enfeebling Skewer weaken, which is extremely massive in any PvE content nowadays. With Fortify being nerfed, it's kind of taken over by weaken, and if you have a team comp that has a lot of different weakens going on at the same time, you will notice a very big difference in terms of how much damage mobs really do to you. And with the Spear having a second weaken since this patch, that is just prime Spear time for PvE content. In my opinion, every group should have a Spear now, and with the DPS that it has, it's actually very effective as a main hand weapon now as well. Now in the context of Angry Earth, the Greatsword in Onslaught stance is still very much up there. Even after it got nerfed in multiple ways, we're still sitting at 13,300 DPS. So it's still good, but this is also a situation where Slash has an advantage. Again, with the Greatsword, similar to the Fire Staff, a big advantage is also that, especially against mob groups, it's very effective because you swing through them with pretty much everything you do. While in terms of rends and weakens it is not as effective as a Spear, it does come with the added utility of having a group pull as well, which is very nice on many mob groups. But the Greatsword has been dethroned by a weapon that doesn't even have type advantage against Angry Earth, and that is the Rapier. With a bleed build or a flourish and finish build, the Rapier comes out at 15,609 DPS, far beyond the competition. The bleed build is just extremely strong at the moment, and I will make a separate video where I'll talk about that in more detail with input from an expert who's been running this build forever, and yeah, it's just completely blowing the competition out of the water. If the thought of having to re-gear to Rapier ever annoys you, worry not, you don't have to. That's because due to the way this build works with its bleeds, only one person per group can actually run this build effectively and reach these DPS values. If you run multiple of them, it becomes very ineffective and you're probably better off having the second Rapier run an evade build instead. So while it's the absolute king of DPS now, it's not something that everyone needs to run, because that wouldn't work, then we would have a problem. But that is just Angry Earth. What about other mob types? When it comes to Ancient, then the Rapier stays on top with the same damage output, and the Spear with light attacks actually takes second place here. That's because the Greatsword drops down to 11,650 DPS, because the slash damage bonus is not existent here. Ancients are weak to lightning, void and strike damage, so really not all too much shifts around. You see that the Void Gauntlet barely makes it up to B tier, but the Hammer makes it up to solid A tier, which is nice. If you're running a mage build, you can see that the Ice Gauntlet is still doing very well here, but the Fire Staff drops off significantly in return with no type advantage. Corrupted are weak to Thrust, Arcane and Nature, and the only one that really matters here is Thrust, which pushes the Rapier and the Spear up, and the Rapier evade build actually gets slightly better than the Greatsword at this point. Not by much, but by enough. The Bow and the Blunderbuss also move up a bit. Obviously the 100% headshot rate moves up higher, and the no headshot rate stays lower, so you have to assume somewhere in between the two. But yeah, they kind of move towards A tier, high B tier, so they are a fair bit more useful here. Lost are weak to Nature, Ice and Strike. Rapier is back to its normal damage, but the Ice Gauntlet pops up to second place here with 12,350 damage. Really cool to see a mage weapon that you use as a main hand to be that high up here, even though the Rapier in a way is also a mage weapon because you run it with a split index build. The strike weakness of Lost is lower than that of Ancients, so the Hammer doesn't really climb up as much here. We don't need to mention the Fire Staff at this point, it's just consistently towards the bottom because it never gets type advantage again, like it does against Angry Earth. Overall, it's just more of an AoE weapon. Against humans, our advantage is slash damage, which brings the Greatsword back to spot number 2. Slash damage advantage is slightly lower than with Angry Earth, but otherwise we see a similar picture. What's mainly different from Angry Earth is that the Fire Staff is lower, which makes some other weapons appear a little bit higher. There is something worth pointing out though, and this is something that applies generally, but I want to mention it here. While the damage advantage against humans is technically slash damage, that is not always the only weakness. The bosses in the Imperial Forge, for example, both Ifrit and Marius, are weak to ice. And because of these specific weaknesses, those boss fights can go differently and certain weapons can be better or worse. In this particular case, if we're factoring in this weakness, then the Ice Gauntlet is actually the third best DPS weapon against those particular human bosses, but it just doesn't apply the same way against mobs. So this is again a situation where you can maybe switch to your Ice Gauntlet for the boss and otherwise run a Fire Staff or something like that, depending on what you want to run, but it is pretty cool to see it catch up here once again. And as our last type, we have Beast with a Thrust weakness, so the Rapier once again higher up, the Spear higher up. Kind of the similar picture to what we already saw with the Corrupted, because it is essentially the same weakness, only 5% less. Overall, we can see that the Bleed Rapier build is a very clear winner, whereas the Greatsword and the Spear are basically in constant competition for the second spot, but that's also fine because you can pretty much run both on the same person if you want to, that's what I do at least. And then the Ice Gauntlet is kind of the unexpected contender creeping into the top areas against certain mobs with certain weaknesses. But there is one thing that we haven't looked at, which is dual weapon setups. There are certain weapon effects that would apply from one weapon to the other. For example, if you're running a Greatsword and you apply bleeds and then switch weapon, or your Spear bleeds. But one particular one is especially notable, and that is the Ice Pylon. With an Ice Gauntlet, you can pretty much dump your kit and just switch to another weapon if you have Ice Pylon, and you will still deal consistently increased damage per second, and also it helps on various boss mechanics. If you have 250 intelligence after empowers and so on, this increases your DPS by roughly 2,500. This is especially notable for the Rapier, which is already the top DPS weapon, because it means on a Corrupted mob, for example, you can almost get up to 20,000 DPS if everything goes perfect. Also, while it doesn't make the Fire Staff or the Void Gauntlet top tier, it puts them in a significantly better place as long as the Pylon is active and consistently dealing damage to whatever is nearby. And that brings me to a more overarching point here that I want you to keep in mind. This is DPS under optimal circumstances. Optimal circumstances will almost never be reached unless you're fighting a completely immobile mob that is just locked in a corner. In most situations, there will be external factors. That is not only the boss mechanics or whatever you need to avoid, or any staggers that may hit you, but also other things that affect your damage the other way around, like empowers and rends and all that kind of stuff that comes with a group dynamic. And that is important to note in the context of your weapon choice. Now, you could just go out and be like, I want the best weapon in terms of DPS and that's all I care for. Sure, there are some players that can get away with that and that will work. But if the whole group plays like that, then you will deal significantly less damage overall than other groups that mix their weapons and spread out the different effects that you want. I would recommend having a spear for the rend and for the enfeebling effects. I would also recommend having a Greatsword for the AoE group DPS. But I would also recommend to have a Great Axe to group mobs very, very easily and to also apply additional weaken to them and then maybe just switch to the other weapon. And I would also recommend having hammers in order to CC enemies more and apply additional rends, because the same rends from different weapons don't stack, but different rends from different weapons do to a larger degree. So there are many reasons to choose many of the weapons on here, even though they may not be the highest in numbers. At the end of the day, I'd rather run with a person using a Void Gauntlet and an Ice Gauntlet with Ice Pylon that actually knows what they're doing, are positioning well, and are utilizing the debuffs to help the rest of the group, than a player that runs a Rapier bleed build but doesn't know where to stand and gets tapped 3 times in a fight. And the same is true for your attribute specs. These builds assume that you're optimizing purely for damage and you're running 5 con. That is fine if you're good enough to run 5 con and you are sure that your group can handle that and is effective enough to do that. I love running 5 con when I'm running with experienced players because it is a very effective way to play dungeons, but if I play with less experienced players, I am happy to go to 50 con, I'm happy to go to 100 con even if it's necessary, and things like that will also affect your damage per second. But while you may have slightly lower damage per second, you will still have more damage per second than somebody who is dead on the floor. Also, it is very much noteworthy that these numbers do not translate well to PvP. In PvP, burst is king and not damage per second, so what you're looking at here will never apply there. You're not gonna heavy attack an enemy 6 times with a Greatsword to get full bleed stacks and all of the benefit of that, because that's just not how PvP works. So PvP would look completely different. But I'm hoping this gives you a useful baseline and maybe also some inspiration to just try out a different weapon, a different build. If you want to get some more inspiration in that regard, I will be talking about the Rapier build in more detail very soon, and we'll also probably have a talk with some speedrunners about the current situation in PvE in general, so that should hopefully be very interesting. If you'd like to see that, consider subscribing and clicking the bell. If you'd like to support me further, you can do so on Patreon. A huge thanks to XR for collecting this data and providing it to me, and a request to you guys to please not send him messages asking stuff about this or asking about what other weapons do and whatnot. Ask it in the comments, and if possible I will direct it to him. He's got enough on his plate already. Also, thanks to my patrons for supporting this video, and thank you for watching. Duke Sloth, out.